A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, Herman, I was looking out the window this morning as a heavy transport plane banked over the city, and it got me thinking about the sheer physical reality of being connected to the rest of the world when you live in a place like Jerusalem. For most people in the world, an airline is just a business. It is a way to get from point A to point B, maybe get some decent pretzels if you are lucky. But here, the national carrier feels like something entirely different. It is more like a strategic bridge or a sovereign umbilical cord. When you see that blue and white Star of David on the tail fin of a Boeing 787 sitting at a gate in London or New York, it is not just a logo. It is a piece of sovereign territory that happens to have wings.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are spot on, Corn. That is exactly the vibe our housemate Daniel was tapping into with the prompt he sent over this morning. He wanted us to really pull back the curtain on the LL operational model, especially given everything that has transpired over the last few years, from the chaos of 2023 through the massive logistical hurdles we saw in June of 2025. It is a fascinating study in what happens when a commercial enterprise is forced to function as a core pillar of national security. We are talking about an organization that has to balance the quarterly earnings reports of a public company with the existential defense requirements of a state under constant threat.
It is the ultimate paradox, right? Is it an airline that happens to be very secure, or is it a security agency that just happens to operate a fleet of aircraft? When you see an LL bird sitting on the tarmac at John F. Kennedy or Heathrow, it looks like any other plane to the casual observer, but the layers of invisible armor around it are unlike anything else in civil aviation. I want to dig into how they maintain that posture, especially when they are operating in foreign hubs where they do not own the perimeter. They are essentially projecting Israeli sovereignty into spaces governed by entirely different legal and cultural norms.
That is the heart of the challenge. Within the walls of Ben Gurion Airport, they have the home field advantage. The entire ecosystem is designed around their requirements. But once that plane touches down in Paris or Los Angeles, they are guests in someone else's house. And as we saw with that major diplomatic spat in France back in August of 2025, those two world sovereign security and international aviation norms do not always play nice together. Daniel's prompt really pushes us to look at the high-protein security, as we like to call it, and how it transitions from a deterrent into a literal lifeline during a hot conflict.
Well, before we get into the diplomatic friction of 2025, let's talk about the baseline. What makes an LL flight different from a security perspective the moment you walk up to the check-in counter? Most of us are used to the TSA style of security in the United States or the standard European protocols, which are very much focused on objects. Do you have a water bottle? Did you take your shoes off? Is there a pair of nail clippers in your pocket? It is all about the what. But LL's philosophy is famously focused on the who.
It is called predictive profiling or behavioral analysis. And for the regular listeners who might find that term a bit loaded, it is important to understand the technical implementation. While a standard security line is trying to find a forbidden object, the Israeli model is trying to identify intent. When you stand in front of that security officer, they are not just looking at your passport. They're conducting a high-stakes condensed interview. This is a method that has been refined over decades, moving away from the security theater we often see elsewhere and toward a deep psychological assessment.
Right, and I have always found those interviews fascinating. They ask these seemingly mundane questions. Where did you stay? Who did you meet? Why were you in this specific neighborhood? Who packed your bags? But they're not actually looking for the facts of your itinerary. They're looking for cognitive load. They are looking for the micro expressions and the physiological tells that happen when someone is trying to maintain a complex lie under pressure. If you tell them you were on a business trip but you cannot remember the name of the hotel or the person you met for lunch, that creates a red flag in their mental algorithm.
It is a fascinating psychological game. If you are a legitimate traveler, answering, "Where did you have dinner?" is easy. It requires zero processing power. But if you are someone with a fabricated cover story, every follow-up question forces your brain to build a new layer of that fiction in real time. That creates a lag. It creates a specific type of stress that these officers are trained to spot. Now, we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room here, which is the ethical and legal debate surrounding this. This method has been criticized for decades because it inherently involves profiling based on ethnicity, nationality, and travel history. Critics argue it is discriminatory and violates civil liberties, leading to lengthy delays and invasive questioning for specific groups of people.
And those criticisms are valid from a civil liberties perspective, but from a purely operational security standpoint, the results are hard to argue with. El Al has not had a successful hijacking since 1968. Think about that. Over 55 years in the most targeted environment on Earth. The 1968 hijacking of a flight from Rome to Tel Aviv by the PFLP was really the catalyst that changed everything. It was the moment the Israeli government realized that they could not rely on international norms or foreign airport security to protect their citizens in the sky. That flight was diverted to Algiers, and the hostage situation lasted for 40 days. It fundamentally broke the trust Israel had in the global aviation safety net.
That event led directly to the doctrine of armed air marshals. Every single LL flight, without exception, has at least two, and often more, undercover armed marshals on board. These are not just guys with a weekend of training. We are talking about elite veterans from special operations units, often from the Yamas or Sayeret Matkal. They are integrated into the cabin in a way that is completely invisible to the passengers. They might look like a businessman in 4B or a student in 32F, but they are ready to respond with lethal force in seconds. They carry specialized firearms with frangible ammunition designed to stop a threat without piercing the aircraft's skin.
And the cockpit is literally a fortress. Long before the rest of the world's airlines started reinforcing cockpit doors after September 11, 2001, LL already had a double-door system. It is a man-trap design. You cannot open the inner door unless the outer door is locked and the area is cleared. It makes a cockpit takeover physically impossible from the cabin. But honestly, Herman, the thing that really blows my mind is the stuff you cannot see from the inside. The actual hardware attached to the airframe that treats a passenger jet like a fighter jet.
You are talking about Sea Music, or, as it is often called in the industry, Sky Shield. This is where LL moves from secure airline into military-grade asset territory. For the listeners who are not familiar, Sea Music stands for Commercial Multispectral Infrared Countermeasures. It was developed by Elbit Systems. It is essentially a large, white, canoe-shaped pod mounted under the belly of the fuselage.
And the backstory there is critical. This was not just a proactive invention. It was a response to a very specific nightmare scenario. In November of 2002, in Mombasa, Kenya, terrorists fired two shoulder-launched missiles, MANPADS, at an Arkia Airlines flight as it was taking off with over 200 passengers. The missiles narrowly missed, but it sent shockwaves through the aviation world. The realization was that an airliner is most vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and traditional ground-based security cannot stop a missile fired from 2 miles away outside the airport fence.
Right? So the Israeli government mandated that their commercial fleet be equipped with a defense system. Sea Music uses a thermal camera to detect the heat signature of an incoming missile's exhaust. The moment it detects a launch, it fires a high-powered fiber laser at the missile's infrared seeker head. It literally blinds the missile, confusing its guidance system and forcing it to veer off course. All of this happens in milliseconds, without the pilots having to do a single thing. It is fully autonomous. But think about the logistics of that, Korn. You are a commercial airline trying to fly into major international airports with a laser-based missile defense system attached to your plane. That creates some serious friction with foreign aviation authorities, doesn't it?
Oh, it is a nightmare of diplomacy and regulation. Many countries are very twitchy about having military-grade sensors and lasers operating in their civilian airspace. There are concerns about interference with ground equipment or the legal status of such hardware. But El Al basically says if we cannot fly with this protection, we do not fly. And because they are a sovereign carrier, it becomes a state-to-state negotiation. This brings us to that France visa dispute in August of 2025. That was a fascinating case study in how this friction can boil over when the host country decides to reassert its own sovereignty.
Yeah, that was a tense few weeks. For those who don't remember, the French authorities at Charles de Gaulle Airport started pushing back on the number of Israeli security personnel El Al was stationing on site. They were essentially saying, "This is French soil. We provide the security. You cannot have a small army of Shin Bet vetted officers running your own parallel security operation in our terminal." The French were also raising issues with the visa status of these officers. They wanted them to be treated as standard airline employees, while Israel argued they should have a status closer to official state representatives because they were performing a national security function.
It got so heated that there was a period where El Al flights to Paris were at risk of being grounded because the security teams couldn't get the necessary clearances to work the gates. Ultimately, a quiet deal was struck involving the Mossad and the French DGSE, but it highlighted the core tension. El Al does not trust anyone else to do their security. Not the French, not the Americans, not anyone. They insist on an unbroken chain of custody, from the moment you arrive at the airport to the moment you leave. They view the foreign airport as a hostile environment that they must navigate with their own protective bubble.
It is that lack of trust that makes them so effective, but also so expensive to operate. Which leads us to the second half of the prompt Daniel sent over, the role of the airline as a national lifeline. We have lived through this over the last few years. When the conflict intensified in late 2023, and then again during the massive escalation in June of 2025, almost every international carrier stopped flying to Tel Aviv. United, Lufthansa, Delta, British Airways. They all pulled out because their insurance companies told them the risk was too high.
That is the crucial point that people often miss. It is not just about the physical danger of a rocket hitting a plane. It is about the math of insurance. If a Lloyd's of London underwriter says your hull is not covered if you fly into a war zone, you simply cannot fly. You would be betting the entire company on every single landing. But El Al did not stop. They actually increased their flight frequency. They became the only way in or out for a country that was effectively under an aerial blockade.
And they could only do that because the Israeli government stepped in with a massive financial shield. We are talking about a 5 billion shekel government guarantee. Essentially, the state of Israel became El Al's insurance company. They said, if a plane is damaged or lost due to hostilities, the taxpayer covers it. That allowed El Al to keep the gates open when everyone else had bolted them shut. It transformed them from a business into a strategic bridge. And the most symbolic moment of that transition, which I think carried a lot of emotional weight for people here, was the decision to fly on Shabbat.
For our international listeners, you have to understand the gravity of that. El Al has not flown on the Jewish Sabbath since the early 1980s due to a political agreement with the religious parties in the government. It is part of their identity as the national carrier of the Jewish state. They lose a lot of money every year by keeping their planes on the ground from Friday night to Saturday night. But in October of 2023, and then again during the crisis in June of 2025, they broke that rule.
They got the rabbinical approval under the principle of pikuach nefesh, the preservation of human life. They were flying reservists back from all over the world. People were dropping everything in New York, London, and Bangkok to come home and serve. El Al was the only way they could get here. Seeing those blue and white planes landing on a Saturday morning was a powerful signal that the normal rules of life were suspended. It was a mobilization of the air.
It makes you realize that their business model is built for the outlier. Most airlines optimize for the 99% of days when everything is normal. They want efficiency, high load factors, and low costs. El Al has to optimize for the 1% of days when the world falls apart. They carry the overhead of that security and that readiness every single day, just so they can function in those moments of crisis. In June of 2025, when we had that second massive closure of the airspace and things were looking very grim, El Al managed to repatriate between 100,000 and 150,000 Israelis who were stranded abroad.
The logistical feat of that is often overlooked. They were running rescue flights from 22 different global hubs simultaneously. They were turning planes around in record time using every available pilot and crew member. They even used their cargo fleet to bring in essential medical supplies and equipment that couldn't wait for sea freight. It was a total integration of the airline into the Ministry of Defense. And that brings us to a very recent example of how uncompromising that posture is, even when things are relatively quiet. You mentioned the February 2026 incident at LAX. That was only a few weeks ago, but it is a perfect example of their zero tolerance threshold.
Right. For those who missed the news, there was a situation where a ground handler at Los Angeles International Airport noticed a small, seemingly innocuous sticker on a piece of luggage that had already been cleared by TSA and was heading toward an El Al flight. It was just a weird, non-standard marking, something that didn't fit the usual patterns of the airport sorting system. In any other airline, they might have just shrugged it off or done a quick secondary scan.
But not El Al. The moment that was reported to the Israeli security supervisor on site, the entire loading process stopped. They didn't just pull that bag, they pulled every single bag off that plane. They offloaded all the passengers who were already seated, brought in their own explosive detection dogs, and did a manual reinspection of the entire aircraft. It delayed the flight by 6 hours and cost the airline a fortune in gate fees and crew time.
And it turned out the sticker was just a prank or a mistake from a different warehouse, right? It was totally benign. But the point is, they didn't care about the delay. They didn't care about the angry passengers or the missed connections. Their doctrine says that if there is a single unexplained variable, the plane does not leave the ground. It is that high-protein security we always talk about. It is not theater. It is a rigid, almost algorithmic adherence to safety protocols that prioritizes the integrity of the flight over the convenience of the passenger.
It really makes you think about the trade-offs. I mean, we talk a lot on this show about efficiency and the modern world's obsession with frictionless experiences. We want everything to be seamless. We want to walk through the airport with our phones and never stop moving. But El Al is the ultimate friction. It is a deliberate, intentional slowing down of the process to ensure that nothing is missed. It is a rejection of the good enough philosophy that governs most of modern life.
It is a bit like what we discussed in episode 997 when we were talking about the aero missile defense system. Remember we talked about the distribute philosophy. The idea that you don't just have one big wall, you have layers and layers of sensors and interceptors that all talk to each other. El Al is the aviation version of that. The interview is a sensor. The Marshal is an interceptor. The C music system is an interceptor. The cockpit door is a hardened barrier. Each layer is designed to fail gracefully because the next layer is already active.
That is a great connection. And just like the Aero system, it is incredibly expensive and requires a level of national commitment that most countries wouldn't tolerate for a commercial enterprise. Which leads to the question, is this model replicable? Could another country, say the United States or a European nation, adopt the El Al model for their own carriers? We see interest in the technology, but the culture is a different story.
I think the answer is probably no, at least not in full. Most countries don't face the same existential persistent threat level that Israel does. For a carrier like United or British Airways, the cost-benefit analysis just doesn't work. The passengers wouldn't stand for the intrusive interviews, and the shareholders wouldn't stand for the massive security overhead. El Al can do it because their market Israelis, and those traveling to Israel, understands the necessity. There is a social contract there. We accept the friction in exchange for the guarantee of a sovereign lifeline. We accept that the person asking us about our dinner plans might be a Shin Bet officer, because we know that same officer is the reason the plane is the safest place in the sky.
And that social contract is backed by the state's intelligence apparatus. We should touch on the institutional ties here, even if it is a sensitive area. It is a poorly kept secret that El Al security is deeply integrated with the Shin Bet, which is the Israel Security Agency. When you are being interviewed at an El Al counter in Berlin, the person talking to you is often a veteran of the security services, and the data they are using to vet you is not just coming from a commercial database. They have access to real-time intelligence that most airlines could only dream of.
Right. They have access to specific threat profiles. If there is a specific cell emerging in a certain region, the security teams on the ground are briefed on it immediately. It makes the airline an extension of the state's defensive perimeter. We actually touched on some of the diplomacy of this in episode 669, Invisible Walls, where we looked at how airlines have to navigate hostile skies. El Al is the extreme version of that. They don't just navigate the walls. They bring their own walls with them. They are a mobile fortress.
I think that is the perfect way to put it. They bring their own walls. And looking forward, I think we are going to see more of this tech trickling down. We are already seeing interest from other countries in systems like C Music for their head-of-state aircraft. The Air Force One of the future will almost certainly have this kind of laser-based protection. But for the average traveler, the El Al model remains a unique outlier. It is a product of a specific geography and a specific history. It is what happens when a nation decides that its connection to the world is too important to be left to the whims of the market or the protection of others.
It is also a reminder of the importance of sovereign capability. One of the big takeaways for me, especially after the June 2025 crisis, is that you cannot always rely on the global market to provide essential services during a conflict. When the international airlines pulled out, Israel was not cut off from the world because it had its own fleet, its own pilots, and its own security. That is a lesson in national resilience that I think a lot of other countries are starting to look at more closely. If you don't have a sovereign air bridge, you are vulnerable in a way that is hard to quantify until the crisis actually hits.
The idea of a sovereign air bridge is becoming a core part of strategic planning in a way it wasn't 10 years ago. If you don't have a carrier that is willing and able to fly when the insurance markets freeze up, you are essentially an island. And in the modern world, being an island, economically, socially, and militarily, is a very dangerous thing to be. El Al ensures that the island remains connected, no matter how high the seas get.
It really does. Well, Herman, I think we have covered a lot of ground here, from the psychology of the behavioral interview to the physics of laser-based missile defense, and the high-stakes politics of sovereign insurance. It is a lot more than just pretzels and extra legroom. It is about the very definition of what a state owes its citizens in the modern age.
Much more. And it is a testament to the people who run that operation. Whether you agree with all their methods or not, the technical and logistical excellence required to maintain that posture for over 50 years is genuinely staggering. It is a high-wire act that they perform every single day, thousands of times a day, across every time zone on the planet.
Well said. And hey, if you are listening and you have ever been through one of those El Al interviews and thought, wow, that was intense, now you know why. There is a very deep, very complex machine working behind those questions. It is not just about you. It is about the integrity of the entire bridge.
We hope this gave you a bit more insight into the why behind the what. If you enjoyed this deep dive, we have a whole archive of similar explorations. Check out episode 997 on the Aero system if you want more on the hardware side, or episode 553 where we discuss the SITREP method for processing intelligence. You can find all of those on our website.
That is right. Head over to myweirdprompts.com. You can find our full RSS feed there, all our past episodes, and a contact form if you want to send us a prompt of your own. We are also on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts to get a notification every time we drop a new episode.
And before we go, if you have been listening to us for a while and you find these discussions valuable, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps the show grow and helps other curious people find us. We really appreciate the support from our community.
Definitely. It makes a huge difference. All right, Herman, I think that is a wrap for episode 1117.
It is indeed. Thanks for joining us, everyone. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, stay curious and keep asking those deep questions. See ya.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change